Welcome back to part 2 for elasticities, ladies and gents. We're going to continue to look at what is this concept of elasticity. Part 1, I finished with you on how to interpret the elasticity coefficient. We're going to start there again just to explain one or two of those interpretations in a little bit more detail. Let's look at EP is equal to naught, perfectly inelastic. What does that actually mean? It means that the product or the demand for that product is not responsive to a price change. Whether the price goes up or down, that quantity demanded is staying the same. Whereas if we go to perfectly elastic, EP is equal to infinity, that tells us it is very sensitive to a price change. When that price changes, the quantity demanded will change by a lot. It's infinite. If we go back to the two calculations you did in part 1, which was the college education and then Tina's pie, education was greater than 1, so that was elastic. I like often to say relatively elastic, whereas Tina's pies, which was less than 1, was relatively inelastic. That means the consumers are not that sensitive to a change in the price of pies. I'm hoping that you're starting to put all of this together. This next slide might help you a little further. Here we go. I take you through and I give you a very brief explanation of each of these, which is what is done in the textbook, but I've just summarized it here so that hopefully it can make it a little bit easier for you to remember each of those categories. A little bit more information going forward. I have already mentioned to you that we're allowed to ignore the negative sign. Let's have a look at some of the other things that are important at this point. Use percentage changes, which are relative, not absolute. Remember, we don't talk about the price changed by 2 Rand and the quantity demanded changed by 4 units. We do use that in our calculation, but the idea is to work out what is the percentage change, because then that allows us to look at the relative changes rather than absolute. The answer that you get in your calculation is an elasticity coefficient. That means it's got no units involved. It is just a number. These coefficients allow us to compare the results. So for example, going back to those two calculations that you've already done, we could see that the one product is more elastic than the other by the comparison. The fact that those products are completely different and possibly completely unrelated doesn't matter. It still allows us to tell whether one product is more or less elastic than another. And then ignoring the negative sign, as I said to you, that negative sign is an indication of direction of change, and that is because the demand curve is a negative sloping, or there's a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. So we're allowed in this particular type of elasticity to ignore that negative. Going forward, that will not be the case any longer. Be careful. Watch out when you can ignore and when you can't. There's another method for calculating price elasticity of demand, which helps us overcome that problem of original price and original quantity. The formula that I've already taught you is called the point method, and that one is your delta Q over delta P times original price divided by original quantity. Now that can present problems when we're trying to calculate elasticity, and that is because those 5 categories that I've taught you of elasticity, all 5 categories can appear in one demand curve. This means that if you are calculating elasticities on a demand curve, it depends where you are on that demand curve as to whether your product is going to be elastic or inelastic. So one of the ways that they've used to overcome this is they use the ARC method, which says we can use the average of our 2 prices and our 2 quantities, which maybe gives us a more accurate indication of the elasticity of demand. And this is your ARC method. So here you'll see your ARC method a little bit more complex than your point method. Make sure you write these down as often as possible. It is the only way that you can really get to remember your formulae. Please, students, believe me when I say that. Write them down every single time you practice, and I promise you eventually they will become almost habit to you. You will hardly have to think about them. You will have missed perhaps what I said there. Now we're going to use the ARC method to calculate elasticity from this information that is given to you here. Please pause at this point. I'm going to move on to the solution slide, but you really should give this a try before you go and have a look at the solution. Moving on. Okay, so the solution came up immediately there. Hopefully you had paused so you wouldn't actually have seen the solution. Or even if you do see the solution, please go and block it for a moment and go and make sure that you can do it without looking. You'll see here I've put in the numbers. Let's have a quick look at Q2 minus Q1. You've always got to check the demand for this product when the price changes from 600 to 800. So from 600 to 800, then we check our quantity from 16 to 12. So Q2 is 12 minus Q1, which is 16. Don't forget your divided. 16 plus 12. So your quantity 1 and your quantity 2. Remember, a divide by 2 actually cancels out. So at this stage, you don't have to put it in. If you feel more comfortable, you can still. But then remember to put it in both on the top and the bottom when you're doing that division. Then we divide by, so remember this is division for everything, and P2 minus P1 divided by P1 plus P2. So looking at your information in your table and being able to carry it through to your formula. Ladies and gents, mostly what happens here is students get themselves confused and then they make silly errors. Just be very careful and methodical in the way that you take your numbers and put them into your formula. Once you've done your calculation correctly, you should get 1. You will get a negative 1 if you've done your calculations correctly. But remember, we're allowed to ignore the negative. That is exactly why I've left the negative out of this solution for you, to remind you that we're allowed to ignore it. This means that this product is unit elasticity. Let's move on. Looking at the different types of elasticity of demand, we're going to run very quickly through each of the others, just so that you can get an idea of how they are applied. There are some practice exercises as well that you'll be able to use, and then the solutions for you to check yourself. Looking first at income elasticity of demand, now we want to know by how much will this demand for our product change as a result of a change in the consumer's income. Please also then notice the rules now with your interpretation and with your calculations. First of all, the negative is now important. You can no longer ignore the negative. If you get a negative answer, it shows that your product is inferior. If you get a positive answer, then it shows that your product is a normal good. But then you also have to check, is it between 0 and 1 or is it greater than 1? Between 0 and 1 is an essential or a necessity good, and then greater than 1 is a luxury. Ladies and gents, you simply have to learn these rules and be able to apply them. Here's your example. So pause now so that you can do the calculation before the solution comes up. The solution will come up on this same slide. So at this point, you want to make sure you stop, do the calculation, and then look at the solution. I'm moving on. So pause. All right, here we go. Here's your solution. Your EY formula that you're using, delta Q over delta income times original income over original quantity. In this case, you get a positive answer, and then you can interpret that. So let's have a look. Coefficient is positive, so this is a normal good. It is less than 1, so it is a necessity or an essential good. Ladies and gents, just looking again, where do we get those numbers from? Your delta Q is simply your change in quantity from 1,000 to 1,100 units. There's your 100. Your delta P is your change from delta I rather, delta income, change in income from 2,000 to 2,500. That's your 500. And then original income and original quantity. Please, ladies and gents, very, very straightforward. There is nothing complicated about this as long as you follow your formula. Looking at cross-elasticity of demand, once again, please pay attention. This is the change in the quantity demanded of one product as a result of the percentage change in the price of another product. For example, Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Expanded version of the formula, pay attention to that, and then make sure you can go and take your numbers, put them into your formula, and be able to get an answer which you then are required to input. Here is your example. You can have a bash at this, pause now, and then the solution will come up on this same slide. I'm now going to pull up the solution. Here we have it. Your cross elasticity of demand, the change in the quantity of your fresh potatoes divided by the change in the price of your oven chips, and then times the price of oven chips, original price, over the quantity of potatoes, original quantity, and that is what will give you your information here. Do your calculation. You should get the answer 3.39. This shows us that the coefficient is positive and your products are substitutes. Ladies and gents, your last type of elasticity is your price elasticity of supply. Once again, you've got to be able to do the calculations. You've got to be able to talk about whether it's elastic or inelastic. And it is very similar to a price elasticity of demand, so please don't confuse the two. Now, folks, this is where we end this support tutorial for this learning unit. Remember, this is not by any stretch all the information that is required. This is just trying to give you a little bit of support in terms of being able to apply your formulas, understand how the formulas are different, and being able to utilize this information in your learning unit in your preparation for your test, your formative assessment, which is your test, and then your final assessment, which is your exam. Good luck, ladies and gents. See you in the next tutorial.